Hello, my name is Jacob, and I am a Norse Pagan, and welcome back to the Wisdom of Odin. Today, we're going to talk about how to create your own Bindrunes. Now, before then, I do have like 60 seconds to catch up. One, if you have not already, I do have an entire video on Bindrunes that goes very much into the history of them, and less so to the creation of them. But if you want to know about the history, the backstory, and all that stuff, that's the video for you. I have several other videos on runes, including one which is an entire step-by-step guide answering your questions on the runes, and I also talk about the struggles I personally have with the runes myself, because the history of them is quite complicated. A recap of the history: essentially you have the stories that talk about the runes in the Prose and the Poetic Edda, and then you have the actual Elder and Younger Futhark runes, and those get often combined, and yet we don't actually know if they're associated with one another. And then you actually have the rune studies within the 1800s and beyond, somewhat beforehand, but for the most part runeology really became a thing in the 1800s. And then you have the modern interpretations of the runes that have existed since around the 1960s with the introduction of Wicca. All right, so I think that is basically the caught up. So again, there's lots of other videos out there to go into this, but I really want to hop into the actual creation of Bindrunes because that's why you're actually going to be watching this video. So I'll be drawing some runes alongside of you here, but most importantly, really the first step of making your own Bindrunes is going to be understanding the runes themselves, or at least the modern interpretation of the rune meanings. So I highly recommend sitting down to understand the actual individual meanings of the runes before diving too deeply into creating Bindrunes. And so this kind of goes into that line from the Have 'em All when it talks about, do you know how to write them? Do you know how to read them? Do you know how to carve them? Do you know how to speak them? And all those things. So know these before diving into Bindrunes. Now, another precursor into this is the online Bindrune, and that's why this video exists, is I want to teach you how to make your own Bindrunes, because here's another line from the Have 'em All that I really think you should consider before trusting online Bindrunes. I counsel you, Lord Fafnir, if you take my advice, you'll profit if you learn it. It'll do you good if you remember it. Don't make shoes and don't make weapons except for yourself. If there's a flaw in the shoe or the spear shaft is crooked, your name will be cursed. So, like, obviously it doesn't mention runes specifically here, but I think runes kind of fit into this. If you want something to have a magical property that helps you out or improves your life in some way, I wouldn't necessarily trust someone that you don't know. And so if you're just getting a random Bindrune from the internet, maybe think about it beforehand, because some of them are quite simple. I'll put an example up here for you. You know, these Bindrunes aren't horrible because they're simple, and so you can kind of see the meaning of the runes. I look at the one for like safe travel, and it's really basic. You got Algies, which is a protection rune, and then you got Rhytho, which is the journey rune. And so yeah, this rune means safe travel. It's pretty easy to understand. But then I look at the love rune and I'm like, what in the world are you talking about? I guess maybe because Gabo is a gift, and then Wunyo, the gift of joy, is maybe what they're going for here. And then you have the good luck rune here, which has a Gabo, which again, gift, but then you have Anzus in there, the gift of wisdom, so maybe that's supposed to mean good luck. Again, you just don't know who actually made these runes. You don't know the person or their intention behind it. And then, you know, you even have courage over here. Is it two Rhythos on top of each other? Is it an Othala with an Algies in it? You know, you just don't know. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't trust any online rune you find, especially if you find a credible source, someone that does it a lot, and someone that you maybe get to know and talk with. I would highly recommend, especially if you're thinking about getting a Bindrune tattoo, get it from someone that you really know, or at least talk to the person that created it. Don't just trust a random Bindrune you find from the internet, because again, if it doesn't work or if it has an ill effect, you're the one that's going to suffer the consequences on that. And so yeah, just highly recommend trusting this source for the Bindrune that you're getting, you know, and just, you know, understanding that not every Bindrune on the internet is going to be exactly the way it says it's going to be. Now with that, I also believe in the modern philosophy. Instead of giving a man a fish, teach a man to fish so you can fish for a lifetime. That's what we're doing in this video, is teaching you how to make your own Bindrunes. Now, getting into that, I do want to start with simple Bindrunes, because this is definitely stuff that you should start with. Again, step one, definitely understanding the runes, their meanings, and everything around that. But step two, we can start playing around and seeing where these Bindrunes take us. And so let's start with something simple like the examples I showed you from the online. Let's do, you know, a 2-rune Bindrune for something like, I don't know, courage. And so, you know, using Urus would probably be a good one because that represents strength, and then maybe Tiwaz. And so again, this is going to be something that's really simple. It's not going to be very complicated. Urus, Tiwaz for victory, but also for strength. And then also the negative side of Urus is going to be kind of that bold-headedness. So maybe that tier rune in there would actually really help you out. So Tiwaz and Urus, I think, is a really simple bind rune that would be easy to create when you're just getting started. And then let's actually look at one of the bind runes I have as a tattoo myself, which is simply a Fehu and a Yera. Now, this is actually the first hand poke tattoo I got when this community really started, and I got it from Caleb. And I got this not necessarily as a magical thing, but again as a symbol for what we were doing, because this was actually the first gathering that we had at all, the first time we ever got together. And so I really wanted to get a tattoo to remember that moment. And so there's no magical nature in this exactly to me, but the runes of Yera and Fehu represent the seasonal cycles and the seasonal gatherings, because this is something we wanted to continue to see for each of the seasonal cycles. And so again, but it's not necessarily something that I imbued with magical properties. Now let's talk about that a little bit before we move into the complicated stuff. And so as far as like what makes it magical, when I mean that, what makes it just a symbol, is really the intention behind it and the ritual you may or may not have around the application of this rune. So if we actually look into history, the historical uses of bind runes were literally as a way to like write things. Let's look at this one example I have here. This literally just means runar. It's on the Kirkby runestone, and it's pretty simple. And again, there's no magical property from this that we can really tell besides the fact that it spells runar and it's on a larger rune stone. And this just spells something, and that's okay. So if you want a rune just to spell something, that's perfectly fine. And if you want a rune just to symbolize something, plenty of bands do this, plenty of bands and other people put together a bind rune to create a symbol for their business, much like I did with the folk bind rune here. But if you want magical properties to it, this is when it's going to get a little bit more woo-woo. So this is when I'm actually going to reference once again the Poetic Edda, but we're going to go to Sigdrifumal, which is the story of a Valkyrie sharing wisdom, much very similar to Odin, how he does in the Havamal, but she specifically talks about runes quite a bit. And here in stanza 6, she mentions, you should carve victory runes if you want to have victory. Carve some on the hilt of your sword. Carve some in the middle of the blade also, somewhere else on the sword, and name tier twice. And then I'm also going to read number 7 here as well, even though it's like a little weird in our modern time, but it has something important here as well. You should learn beer runes if you don't want another man's wife to abuse your trust if you have tryst. Carve them on your drinking horn and on the back of your hand, and carve the rune in on your fingernail. Now, starting with stanza 7 there, like the interesting part here is talking about how it has to be on the back of your hand, carve it on your drinking horn, carving on your fingernail. There's obviously a little bit more here. And again, I don't think we're talking about actually carving in your fingernail, but I could be wrong here. Now, stanza 6 is actually what I want to focus on here because of that Tiwaz rune we already talked about earlier. And so if you want this to have magical properties, back to our Tiwaz and our Uruz rune, and you're putting it on something, chant Tyr's name twice, because it tells you to do it right here. And I think that automatically gives you more of a magical property. And so when you're making these runes, if you do want them to have more of a magical property to them, chanting their name and even giving like an offering to Odin, I think is a really good way. Now, again, this is a little bit more of a modern interpretation of bind runes, but I do think sitting down to honor the god that created the runes, that found the runes, is a really good way to activate the runes. So giving an offering to Odin, thanking him for his wisdom, chanting the name of the runes, and then a tattoo is honestly a really good offering in itself, because a tattoo, you're offering up blood and you're offering up your own pain and a spot on your body forever. Actually, just right here, I got another rune tattooed on me here. It's a non-Zeus rune, so I got this recently. But again, I didn't necessarily give a full ritual for it, but again, it was just the sacrifice of putting it on your body. But again, this is something that's more of just a symbol for me of, Anzus and seeking wisdom. But again, if you want a magical property to a rune, chanting the name of the runes, giving an offering to Odin, I think is a really good way to start. And then you start getting a little bit more serious on the actual usage of the bind runes. All right, let's get complicated here. So we're going to move to runes that are multiple different runes, repetitive runes, and all these things. I definitely think if you're getting started, definitely start with 2 to 3. Start there, stay there for a while, get comfortable, see what they do, have some fun with it, get creative. But when we want to get more complicated, this is something that takes a lot of time. And I will say, I do not design a lot of bind runes. I am very, very picky because, again, I truly believe that you have to have a good trust between two people before you start developing bind runes for one another. So I had a really good friend in the community and a fellowship leader, Darius, asked me to create him a bind rune. And so I was like, you know what, I'm going to do this. I'm going to sit down and create a bind rune for him. And so I created this. this sigil. And there's a lot going on here. So this sigil has the central point of Hagalaz, or haggle. And so typically this is not a good rune because it means natural pain, hail, the natural order of things. But he wanted to create this rune for something that could contain, that kind of chaos, that could contain and allow one to focus. And so the idea behind this bind rune was to focus everything around it. And so there's really only a few runes going on here, but there's multiples of those runes. So you have Hagalaz in the center, which is what we're trying to contain that natural chaos. And then we have Algi's runes around the 4 quadrants. And then we also have Anzus runes around those as well to all kind of bind together that Hagalaz rune. And then we even have Urus around the corners of it as well. And so this Uru is, again, just additional strength into the Algi's runes. And hopefully here you're seeing that the personal interpretation of runes is going to really come into the creation of bind runes. Furthermore, why you should really know the person creating your bind runes, and you should really understand them if you're creating them yourself. And so complicated runes like this, like there's only 4 or 5 actual runes in here, but I have duplicated them several times. Now, in closing here, why would you want to create a bind rune? I mean, hopefully, if you've watched this video so far, you understand why. But I really legitimately think that bind runes are something that can really connect us to the faith, especially if you're performing a ritual. Bind runes don't have to just be tattoos. They can be put on something that is given as an offering, which I think is really great. And so if you want to actually take a moment to sit down and carve a bind rune or paint a bind rune into something you're going to burn for the gods, bury for the gods, or leave for the gods in nature, or leave for the spirits, I think this is a really good way to build depth within your ritual practice. And I think this is something that, I've talked about recently with the shaman video, is when it comes to these deeper subject matters of bind runes and things like that, is don't expect to get to the master level overnight. Working with runes has been a multiple year thing for me. I've had someone teach me the runes, which I talk about in the videos that I've created around this. And so I've not been alone in this. I've had a teacher in the runes, and I'm not very, I'm very tight with them. I don't do things with the runes very often. They're a very sacred thing for me. And so I do think there's a balance in this world. Obviously, I do think that runes should be used, but I think they're used too much at some times, especially in modern media. You see runes everywhere, but again, I have runes all over my body. I have tattoos of several runes on me. There's a rune on my Mjolnir. They're everywhere. And so I think, just taking it one step at a time. When you first get into this faith, runes don't have to be everywhere. It's going to be a natural process. And I do hope that this video actually helps you out in the creation of your own bind runes. Again, hopefully I've hammered it in that you should trust yourself and trust the people making these bind runes before you get one, especially tattooed on your body. All these names coming down right here are the amazing people that support this channel. So thank you all so very much for everything you do to make sure this channel keeps going. And if you want to join these names on this list, please think about going down below to my Patreon. I have a lot of content there for you, including our community Discord, early access videos, live streams, a book supporter tier. That book is coming out really soon. And of course, you can get your name in the credits here. So thank you once again to all these names. Thank you everyone who joined me for this video, and I hope it was helpful for you. And until the hall, Skull.